Brian Bethel was a veteran journalist from Abilene, Texas, and in January of 1996, he unwittingly stumbled upon one of the strangest stories of his career. And oddly enough, it was a story he himself experienced. On this night in particular, Brian had pulled into the parking lot of a movie theater in order to write a quick check. He was on his way to pay his internet bill and figured the light of the marquee would be enough for him to scribble out this check real quick. As he is writing the check, he hears knocking on his driver's side window. He glances back and sees two boys between the ages of 10 and 14. The older of the two boys had an olive complexion and wore a black hoodie, and the younger of the two, who was described as very pale, had reddish hair and freckles. The younger boy seemed nervous, perhaps agitated even, but the older one spoke with perfect confidence. "Can you give us a ride?" the boy asked. Immediately, the boys made Brian feel uneasy. No, more than uneasy. They made him feel terrified. But that was kind of silly, wasn't it? They were just a couple of kids after all. "We want to see Mortal Kombat, but forgot our money at home. Can't you give us a ride home?" Brian explained to him that he was kinda in a hurry, and besides, by the time he would take them home to get the money and then back to the movie theater, they'd miss a good chunk of the movie anyway. "Can't you just let us in?" Now the boy sounded aggressive. "Come on, we can't get in your car unless you let us in, you know. We're just two little boys." Despite his uneasiness, he finds that his hand is on the door handle, ready to unlock it. But then he looks up and locks eyes with the older boy, and the eyes that stared back at him were no human eyes at all. Instead, staring back at him were nothing more than two round pools of blackness. No irises, no pupils, no whites in the eyes at all. The boys start pulling at the door handle, now demanding that Brian let them in. "We don't have a gun. We won't hurt you," they said. Snapping out of his frightened state, Brian puts the car in drive and speeds off as fast as he can. And for a year, he didn't tell anyone about these black-eyed children. But one day, he decided to post his story on an internet forum. And since then, the black-eyed kids legend has continued to grow. People all around the world have claimed to encounter these beings. And the question is it simply just an urban legend, or could the black-eyed kids be real? Are they really out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for someone to invite them in? Hello, dear people, and welcome back to Paranormal Community College. I'm your host, Riley, and we're finally talking about the black-eyed kids. Now, to be honest, I was a little hesitant to do an episode on the black-eyed kids. One, because every single paranormal podcast out there has an episode dedicated to them already, and two, because reading stories about the black-eyed kids gives me really dark vibes. But a couple people have requested this topic, and some of these stories are pretty compelling. And after researching for this episode, all I'll say is I really hope there is no such thing as the black-eyed kids. I will take gray aliens, Bigfoot, or even ghosts any day, but soulless children made of nothing but darkness terrorizing you? No, thank you. Also, real quick, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please make sure you like, follow, or subscribe, and tell your friends and family about it, because honestly, even word of mouth helps more than you know. I very much appreciate it. But anyway, let's talk about these little weirdos, shall we? So no one really knows exactly who or what the black-eyed kids are, if they are more than just an urban legend. No one knows exactly where they come from. However, I did come across an interesting Native American legend that some say could be an origin story for the black-eyed kids. There's actually an ancient Iroquois legend about the Otcon, a dark force that had the power to take over children's souls. Some evil entity would mate with a human woman, and so her offspring would have these black eyes and chalky white skin. The tribe would kill and burn the bodies of these offspring so they couldn't resurrect themselves, but living children could also be taken over by the Otcon. Children who had been taken over by the Otcon could be seen wandering through the forest with their black eyes, and they'd be muttering to themselves over and over again, acting nervous and agitated. But in modern legend, the BEKs, as they are sometimes called, are children in between the ages of about 6 and 16. They almost always appear at night, usually in rural areas or on the outskirts of town. Their complexion has been described as pale white or olive-toned, and if you listen to the Men in Black episodes, that may ring a bell. The Men in Black are said to have a complexion that is either stark white or tannish in color. Sometimes they are said to wear old-timey clothing like something from the 1920s or 1940s, and they are said to have a strange manner of speaking, also much like the Men in Black. Some have described it as robotic or monotone, as sounding neither masculine nor feminine, or perhaps a combination of the two. Their responses to witnesses' questions sound robotic as well, as if they only have a few phrases in their repertoire. Some have even said that they have talon-like feet. But in every instance, they, of course, have the completely jet black eyes. Some witnesses have claimed that after they interacted with these BEKs, they had a lingering sickness, they were nauseous, lethargic, and they had severe brain fog. Almost always, the eyewitness talks about how strange it was that a child could leave them with such a sense of all-encompassing dread and fear, the kind of icky feeling that leaves a lump in your throat and your stomach in knots. They seem to just ooze darkness. The general idea is that these beings are perhaps soulless, that nothing exists behind those dark eyes besides more blackness, a void. These children often target people who are alone in their cars or alone in their homes. They knock on your windows or your doors, and at first, they ask you to invite them in. They usually ask for water or food, or very often they ask to use the telephone. And you may even find yourself unlocking the door. That is until you see their blacked out eyes. And the story goes that once you notice their inhuman eyes, they become hostile, now demanding that you let them in. But I suppose a better way to really illustrate just who or what the black-eyed kids are is to share a few stories about them. So here we go. Now, the general consensus is that this whole legend started back in 1998 when Brian Bethel posted his story online. However, I found a couple stories before 1998. Our first one takes place in Virginia in the year 1950. The witness in question was a 16-year-old boy named Harold, and Harold was walking home from school when he noticed a little boy leaning up against a fence. Harold tried to talk to the boy, but the boy remained silent. However, as Harold was about to leave, the little boy said, "I want to go to your house. You're going to walk me up to your house." At that moment, Harold realized that the boy had black eyes, and he thought about turning and running away, but before he could, the little boy said, "Now don't you go running away from me. You're going to take me to your house." Well, Harold, being the smart boy he was, ran the hell away from that little creep. He ran as fast as he possibly could, and from behind him he heard this yelling, this screeching noise. He described it as sounding kind of like a bobcat. He told his parents what had happened when he got home, and they actually believed him. His mom took him to a priest, saying that she believed Harold had had a run-in with the devil himself. And his father went out looking for the little sucker with his shotgun. The black-eyed boy was never found, of course, and Harold never had an experience like that again, thankfully. And then there's this next story from France in 1974. Two men were driving around a small village when they stopped in front of a house while attempting to turn their car around. In the courtyard on the property, the two men saw 5 young girls staring at them. They were about 4 feet tall, had long blonde hair, and were all wearing the same white gown. However, they all also had those coal black eyes. The black-eyed girl that was closest to the men motioned for them to come closer, but they sped off as fast as they could, immediately getting those creepy dark vibes. While someone else claimed they had also seen the odd children, no one was able to locate them later on. So there is some evidence that the black-eyed kids legend has existed before 1998. And so our next story is going to take us to Ireland. And, a woman walking alone at night can already be kind of sketchy at times, but one woman who is from Northern Ireland got the fright of her life one night when she was walking home. The year was 2009, and 18-year-old Caris Holdsworth was making her way home in the town of Lisburn. As she approached her flat, which was located in the rougher part of the neighborhood, she could see 2 figures standing in her small yard. As she got closer, she could see that they appeared to be teenagers, maybe 14 to 16 years old. But as she opened her gate, she immediately felt uneasy. She reached in her purse and found her pepper spray, just in case they tried anything. What was so unsettling is that the two boys had their backs turned to her as she walked past them towards her front door, which is just creepy. Before she could climb the few steps leading up to her front door, though, the two boys turned around and looked at her. She said as soon as she looked them in the eye, she felt raw, primal fear for perhaps the first time in her life. She grabbed her pepper spray a little tighter, and they said, "No need for that. We just want to borrow your phone, miss." Like they knew what she had in her hands that were in her purse. Not knowing what to do, she reached for her keys and made her way to the front door. "Please, miss, my mother won't be happy if she doesn't know where we are." She felt bad for them for a split second, and then she looked again into the boys' eyes and saw, of course, that they were pitch black. She fiddled around with her keys for a second, swung open the door, and locked it shut. For a while there was silence, but she was too afraid to look out of her window. She was afraid that if she did, she'd see those black eyes staring back at her. But soon enough, the knocking started. They began knocking and wouldn't leave her alone. And so she looked through her peephole, and she was mortified when she saw that their faces took up the whole peephole. Their black eyes were just staring back at her blankly, and they kept demanding for her to let them in, saying things like, "We won't hurt you, miss. We don't have any weapons." Now furious and annoyed, Karis swung the door open and asked them, "What do you want?" The older boy said, "We want to use your phone. We have no weapons to hurt you with." Karis tells them to get the hell away from her flat and then slammed the door in their faces once more. A few moments later, she was brave enough to look through the peephole again, and they were still there, just staring at her through the peephole. Karis called a friend and told her to come over immediately, that it was an emergency. And by the time her friend arrived, there was no creepy children around, and her friend was able to calm her down enough that she could get some sleep. However, the experience scarred her for life, and to this day, she is still afraid to look through the peephole, for fear that she might again see those black, soulless eyes staring back at her. And for this next story, I'm not quite sure on the year, but it's coming from a man named Jim Stills. And Jim would often spend his evenings hanging out on his front porch smoking cigarettes. One night, he noticed a young boy walking down the road awkwardly. It was like he was very stiff in his movements, and it just felt off. He kind of became fascinated with this boy as he started inevitably showing up night after night, walking down the road in the same odd fashion. Eventually, it just really started to creep Jim out, so he stopped hanging out there, but as time passed, he decided to have one cigarette on the front porch again. But as he opened the door, his heart dropped to his stomach because standing right in front of him, in his doorway, was a child with black eyes. He said it was like the boy lacked any kind of emotion or even a soul, and he spoke in a monotone, robotic fashion. And he asked Jim to let him inside his home, and with that, Jim slammed the door in the creepy little boy's face and promptly stopped his nightly smoke sessions after that. And dude, if a black-eyed kid ever shows up on my doorstep, I'm legit having a heart attack. I could not deal with that shit. You could put the most bizarre-looking alien thing in front of me, and I'd be like, okay, that's pretty cool. But this black-eyed kid shit is just terrifying and better be an urban legend. This is one that I really hope is an urban legend, to be honest. But okay, moving on. We have a story from a United States Marine. While based at Camp Lejeune in November of 2009, this Marine was alone in his room watching a movie when he heard knocking at his door. Figuring it was just his roommate, he opened the door without hesitation. However, standing there in the doorway were two children. He said their aura was so dark and so nasty and so evil that his first impulse was to slam the door in their faces. However, he was kind of frozen in fear when he realized they had jet black eyes. The Marine asked them, "What do you want?" And while staring at him blankly, they replied, "It's cold outside and we want to come in and read." The Marine could see that no one else was in sight and it was just him and these two creeps in the corridor. He quickly gave in to his first impulse and slammed the door on them. However, he claims the knocking went on for several minutes after, and it sounded like the black-eyed kids were also rattling his doorknob. Without going into too much detail, the Marine asked people around the barracks if they had seen or heard anything strange that night, but it appeared he was the only one who saw the children. And then there's a story from an Ohio man in July of 2010. The witness was a security guard at a data center building and was on the night shift. Just before 5 a.m., the security guard went outside for a cigarette break when he noticed what looked like two young boys across the street just staring at him motionless while he smoked. The sight of them unnerved him a little bit, their stillness, but he finished his cigarette and went back inside. And while inside, he sat in front of the security system monitors. Soon enough, the two boys became visible on the monitors. They were standing under the security camera at the front door. The security guard pressed the talk button and said to the boys, rather annoyed, "What do you guys want? I'm busy." Neither of the boys spoke, but one of them waved his hand as if motioning the security guard to come outside and join them. He pressed the talk button again, told them they needed to leave, and then attempted to get back to his duties, but they kept buzzing the front door. For a little while, he tried to ignore it, but eventually he pressed the talk button again and told the boys they needed to leave the premises. The buzzing stopped, but the two continued to stare at him through the security camera. It felt like they could somehow see him through the camera. Finally, the security guard marches down to the front door, ready to tell them off, tell them that he was going to call the police. But before he could tell the boys he was going to call the cops, the older of the two boys said, "That won't be necessary. We just want to come inside to use your phone. Can't you let us in?" The security guard nervously took out his cell phone and told them he's going inside to call 911, and no, they can't come in. No one is allowed in. He returned to the safety of his security monitors. However, the boys continued to just stare at him eerily until the smaller of the two walked around the back of the building and stared at him through another camera. Now, the security guard was petrified. He may have been bluffing about calling the cops beforehand, but now he was serious. He dialed 911 and sat there sweating as he wondered what they would do next, hoping that the cops would arrive on time. But somehow in unison, the two walked to a blind spot of the building, but the security guard still felt as if he was being watched. However, by the time the police finally arrived, there was no sign of the two boys. And this next story takes place at a gas station in northeastern Louisiana in September of 2015. And you know the kind of gas station I mean, the ones that somehow only exist at 3 a.m. when there's no other services for miles, the kind you only stop at if you absolutely have to. The kind of old, dark, decrepit building that makes you wonder if it's even open in the first place. But indeed, there was a single attendant working at this gas station that night, and around 3 a.m., the power went out, leaving him alone in the darkness. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, offering him enough light to get back to the generator. He fired up the generator, and sure enough, the power was partially restored. But for some reason, the only lights that came on were the ones in the parking lot and the ones just behind the register. The rest of the store was dark. He thought to himself that, well, they had been having some strong winds that night. The power was liable to go out anyway. It is what it is. But then he noticed figures coming out of the darkness outside. As they got closer, he could see that they were 3 kids on bikes. There were 2 boys and 1 girl, and they rode up to the front doors. He stood there wondering if they were gonna come in. The doors weren't locked or anything. But eventually he went and opened the door and asked them what the heck they were doing out and about this time of night. He was startled, but at this point he was mostly concerned that the kids were okay. Maybe they needed something, maybe they needed to use a phone. And sure enough, the girl spoke up and asked him if they could use his phone. And so he hands her his cell phone. And at this, he notices that this girl is perhaps no girl at all. She has the eyes the color of obsidian, no white at all, no pupil, no iris, just plain black. She and the other 2 boys have olive-toned skin, and the 3 of them just exuded darkness, evilness. The store attendant was immediately overcome with dread. When he handed her his cell phone, the girl said, "No, not that phone, the real one," looking at the landline inside. Without a word, the attendant shut and locked the doors and shouted at the kids to go home and get out of here. Eventually, the trio gave up on whatever they were trying to do and rode off into the dark night. When his boss showed up a couple hours to relieve him, the attendant told him what had happened, and he asked his boss to pull up the security cameras. He had to know that he wasn't crazy or something. But unfortunately, as things like this always go, there was no camera footage while the power was out, and the entire interaction went unrecorded. If this story is true, though, It's again interesting that these things need to be invited in, even if the door is unlocked. They need the owner's permission. But you might be wondering, well, what happens to someone who does decide to let these little creeps in? Surely there must be someone dumb enough to do so, or perhaps someone who feels guilty enough to do so. Well, for our last story, I have just that kind of tale. The year was 2015, and it was winter in rural Vermont. A woman and her husband were hunkering down indoors during a blizzard when they heard knocking at the door. The hour was late, and the woman thought that perhaps someone had gotten stuck out in the road and needed some help. She took a peek out the window and noticed small footprints in the snow. But before she answered the door, she decided to wake her husband up, just in case whoever was at the door was up to no good or something. The two of them answered the door together, and before them, they saw two small children on their doorstep, a boy and a girl about 8 years old. The woman said she was immediately unsettled by the two. She sensed that something about them was just off. They weren't in appropriate clothing for the weather, and for lack of a better word, they were just creepy. But seeing that they were indeed stuck in the snow, a guilty conscience got the better of her, and she let the two children in. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? No one wants to be the dick that won't open their home up to a couple of abandoned children, but it's creepy to have anyone show up unannounced on your doorstep these days. And something about these visitors in particular doesn't seem right. The man and woman offered up the couch to the two little ones while she went to the kitchen to grab them some hot chocolate. While she was in the kitchen, her husband asked the kids some questions. Where's your parents? Can you call your mother? How the hell did you end up alone at night during a blizzard? And no matter what questions they asked, the children simply replied, "Our mother will be here soon." "Are you hungry? Our mother will be here soon." "Do you know how you got here? Our mother will be here soon." It was very bizarre. And their suspicions that something wasn't quite right with them was confirmed when the woman handed them their hot cocoa and got a glimpse of their unnatural eyes that were nothing more than pools of blackness. She struggled to maintain her composure after she locked eyes with them, and one of them suddenly asked if they could use the bathroom. She directed them to the bathroom, and then she noticed that her husband's nose was bleeding. As she went to grab her husband a tissue, she saw the two children standing at the edge of the hallway just staring at her. "Our parents are here," they said, and then walked out the door into the snowy night. After a moment, the woman walked to the front door and watched as the two got into a black luxury car of some kind. Standing outside the black car were two tall figures in black suits, and they too entered the car and drove away. After this, the woman claimed that her husband suffered from intense headaches and nosebleeds in the days following the encounter, and she herself was left feeling nauseous and lethargic. And okay, hear me out. What if these aren't all just urban legends, and what if there is some kind of being responsible for both the men in black and the black-eyed kids, since they are so similar, kind of? What if they are some kind of monster who appear to us in only a somewhat human form? Some have postulated that perhaps they feed off of our fear, acting as some kind of energy vampire. Like the Men in Black, it does have all the good makings of a really good urban legend, a story that has been added to our folklore, our mythology, after a few decades of playing telephone. Theories on who these beings may be range from vampires to aliens and pretty much everything in between. The fact that they seem to need permission to enter someone's house is very vampire-y, and they do indeed seem soulless. There are some too who are of the belief that these beings, the black-eyed kids, Men in Black, the Hat Man, all sorts of interdimensional entities, feed off of our fear as a kind of food source. So that's creepy. Others say, well, maybe they are just ghosts of children who have forgotten they are human, or who are wandering around listlessly in between our world and the world beyond. Some say, well, they must be demons. They got the black eyes, they make people feel sick, they make people feel terrified simply by existing. And then somehow some people think they might be aliens who are masquerading as humans and who are trying to break into our house to suck the life out of us or something. But I want to take a minute real quick to talk about the illness some people experience after a BEK encounter, or after a Men in Black encounter, or even an alien encounter. If these experiences are occurring in some kind of other dimension or other bubble of reality within ours or next door to ours, if the phenomena is really all related in this way somehow, Perhaps humans being in that bubble of weirdness for even a few seconds has some kind of negative side effect on us. Like our physical bodies can't handle it and that's why we get sick. I don't know, just thinking out loud over here, I guess. But anyway, that about does it for the Black Eyed Kids for now, at least. If you've had an experience of your own, please reach out or feel free to leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. I'm going to try to get back to doing video as soon as possible. I'm shooting for a couple weeks from now, maybe sooner. This is just, it's a lot of work, y'all, and I got a day job, so bear with me. But with that, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you next time where I'm going to be talking about Dolores Cannon's book, Between Death and Life. So if you're into afterlife stuff, reincarnation stuff, be sure to check that one out. And take care, everyone.